Hello and welcome to A Novel Idea, the show where we interview authors. I am your host, Noelle Boc, and with me today I have Michael Ansara. Hi, welcome. Thanks for joining me today.
Noelle, it's a great privilege. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So, you have a book, The Hard Work of Hope. I, of course, always read all of my books all the way through. So I've read all about it and all about you. So you have had a very long and fairly storied career, actually, as an activist here locally in Massachusetts. So obviously I know your story, but our watchers don't necessarily know anything. So just talk a very little bit about just how you got started.
So I was very young, 13 years old, and got caught up in the civil rights movement here in Massachusetts, at first supporting the sit-ins in the South, and then actually organizing in Boston. There was a absolutely wonderful group of black leaders who adopted me. I have no idea why. I mean, 13, 14, 15, pimply-faced, ignorant white boy, but they adopted me. Noel Day, Reverend Breeden, Sarah Ann Shaw, who many people know was a journalist. In those days, she was an organizer. And they taught me organizing. And from that, I went to college in 1964, and I became a regional organizer for Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, and started to build a student movement. And in late 64 and early 65, we called for the first march in Washington against the war in Vietnam. And I spent much of the next 10 years organizing against the war in Vietnam. And then from that, tried haltingly and with lots of mistakes to learn how to be a community organizer.
The early part of your book, when you're talking about the 60s, and you talk about this whole idea of the new left.
Right.
So talk about what the new left was, because I thought that was fascinating.
So in the early 60s, we wanted to create a new left, and we were very conscious of not wanting to be part of the old left. So we didn't admire the Soviet Union or China. We didn't want to have state control of everything. We wanted to build a left that was rooted in American experience, that talked in an American language, and was all about extending democracy and finding new ways for people to make the decisions that would shape their lives, whether that was students like us, we felt should have a bigger role in what universities did, or whether the communities that people lived, or even the jobs that people had. And so the new left was really very visionary, very democratic, and a sharp break from the traditions of the old left. In many ways, what happened is we set out to build that, and then the war in Vietnam consumed us. And that project really never was built.
Yeah, I see that. And so you didn't say where you went to school, but you went to Harvard.
I went to Harvard, yes.
You went to Harvard.
Yes, I did.
And, Harvard, look, no one thinks of Harvard without thinking of like elitism,
right.
As
right.
it is. And so I thought that was very interesting in the book as well, that you're part of this student movement at Harvard that's actually pushing back against the elitism. And you felt like that the administration, a lot of people were very out of touch with the student body.
Totally. They had no idea what we were thinking of. And they and I have to say, looking over all these years, it seems that university presidents just have a very hard time learning how to deal with student protests, and just have this reflex. But in those days, in particular, the deans and President Pusey just had no comprehension of what was going on with their students. I mean, just absolutely none, and made mistake after mistake after mistake. And it culminates in the strike of 1969, where we had seized a building, and I really believe that if Harvard had simply let the protesters stew in that building, nothing really would have happened. The campus was overwhelmingly against the war, but they were not in support of seizing a building. But Harvard had done a study of the Columbia uprising the year before, and their conclusion was that Columbia had not sent in the police fast enough. And so they were determined if this happened at Harvard, and they knew there was a good chance it would, they would send in the police early. And so they had no idea what that meant. And, it led to the police not only assaulting and beating the students that were in the building, but then continuing to beat people in Harvard Yard who were coming out to see what was going on. And so even students who were opposed to the building occupation were getting beaten.
There's just so much that happened on that Harvard campus, and I'm sure in other campuses as well,
all other campuses,
across the country. But because we know Harvard, right? Like, I assume like a lot of people have gone through Harvard Yard at the very least as a tourist or whatever. I can't count the number of times I've been in Harvard Square. So to see and listen to, and to me it seems shocking that there'd be police, dragging students out and beating them I'm like, what? That this happened? Like, why would this be happening? But that's the amazing piece, is like of the protests and the activism. And I was just like endlessly impressed that you started out so young and then you just kept going.
Kept going.
You just kept going.
It's ironic after all those years of criticizing Harvard. I've helped organize, just in a small way, an effort of the alumni recently called Crimson Courage, which has urged Harvard to resist the demands of Trump and then supported Harvard for doing that. And so some of us were going to Alumni Day, which is a big thing in Harvard Yard,
right, yep.
And passing out stickers and telling people to support the Harvard administration. And a few of us had to I joke, had to practice in the mirror. I'm here today to support the Harvard administration. It didn't come naturally.
Because always that. Now do you have, I was just curious about this because I didn't try to count, but do you have like a rough count of like how many times you've been like arrested and how many times you've been like beaten? physically attacked?
I actually don't. I mean, I was arrested, certainly more than a dozen times. I got off pretty lightly. I never was actually convicted and sentenced to anything. It was continuation or, no finding or thrown out for one reason or another. I also got off pretty easily, unlike some of my close friends. I have a really good friend from high school named Ron Carver, and Ronnie went to Mississippi in 1964 for Freedom Summer and stayed. And he spent 3 years in Mississippi being chased by police, by the Klan, by White Citizens Council, being threatened in an incredibly dangerous situation. And then he goes back to college to Columbia and ends up as the press spokesman for the Columbia Strike Committee in 1968. So this guy who's made it unscathed through Mississippi the police are storming the campus, and some deans see him and say, Ronnie, because you've been the press spokesman there, police looking for you, go into this building and hide because you'll be safe. And he walks into the building to find that they have sent him into a trap, and there's a bunch of plainclothes police with blackjacks and sap who beat him so badly that when I saw him a week later, I literally could not recognize him. But I got off easily. I got beaten a few times, but nothing really serious.
No serious scars.
No, and there would be times where, there were a couple of detectives in Boston and one in particular in Cambridge who loved to throw me up against the wall, bring out their gun, put it to my head, and said one of these nights they were going to blow out my brains. But, they never did. And so,
but I mean, that's still pretty terrifying.
Yeah.
Would you be terrified at least the first time?
Well, I didn't appreciate it, but I would just say to myself, they're not going to do it here on the street. and you know, they did catch some of my close friends in back alleys and beat them reasonably badly. But as I say, I got off pretty easily, all things considered. And you know, what happened in those days was that there was this downward spiral between us and the police. They would beat us and we would hate them, and then we would start to fight back, which would make them hate us even more.
Right.
And you know, we really dehumanized them and they really dehumanized us. And it was a really downward spiral for a number of years with ever increasing violence. And you know, and I regret that we didn't hew completely to nonviolence throughout the anti-war movement. When I look back, that's one of the things I regret, which is nonviolence has to be absolutely the pillar of protests and opposition and civil disobedience. And we strayed from that, and I think did great harm to ourselves and to the country.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, violence just begets violence, right? And that's just the way that it goes. Well, we're going to take a quick break so you can read a little something from your book, and then we'll get back to talking after that.
All right, thank you. I walk, slightly limping, down Harvard Avenue into Coolidge Corner with its stores and restaurants. Walking past Woolworths, I see a small group of picketers circling back and forth, carrying signs. After watching for a few minutes, I ask a tall young man what they're doing. He says they are supporting Negro students in North Carolina who were refused a cup of coffee at a Woolworths, and so are sitting at the lunch counter until they get served. Segregation has to go, he says. America is the land of the free, he says. Everyone has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he says. Negroes are Americans too. Sunlight filters on the sidewalk. I step into the slow-moving line, step into the movement, step out of adolescent despair and bleakness and into a new life. I do not think about what I am doing. With impetuous certainty, I know my place is in that line. Only much later will I consider why I took that first step into a life of activism. Despite the beatings, despite the arrests, despite the shootings, despite the deaths, they brought legal segregation to an end. They integrated the South. They won voting rights. They changed America. How could I not fall in love with those young men and women only 6, 7, and 8 years older than I? How could I not dream of following in their footsteps? How could I resist the magnetic pull of such gigantic hope? I could not. I dove into the movement. I plunged in without any hesitation and with fierce joy.
That is a great passage, I have to say. I'm like listening to it, I'm like, yes, of course. And you just felt like you had that, all of that just came to you, and this is what I should be doing, which is amazing. And you know, I feel like, you know, a lot of people come in and out of activism, right? Like but you get that inspiration point, right? There's always that inspiration point. Now you have rubbed shoulders, I should say, and shaken hands with a lot of quite famous and, dare we say, infamous characters throughout your career as well. We can name names because you name them in your book, so that's all right. But if there's some people that you've met that would really stand out in your years of activism, and I know, like, you talk about meeting with Mike Dukakis and, you know, working with, you know, different mayors and, you know, people like that. But who would pop out at you as somebody that, or a couple of people maybe that you were like, you know, these are people that.
Well, so one that just stays with me and always does, and that, you know, particularly in these days when it's a struggle to be hopeful, I think of Fannie Lou Hamer. a Mississippi sharecropper, mother of many children, maybe finished high school, not sure if she finished high school, who became a leader in Mississippi, and knew that she would be beaten when she went to register to vote and brought other people to vote, and still did it. Knew that she would be threatened and arrested, and still did it, and was for me just a profound inspiration, and also an example of how much potential people have and how people can change and grow. I think if you're an organizer, you really have to believe in people. You have to love people, even people who don't agree with you. And you have to see in everybody the potential to do extraordinary things and really believe in them. And, Fannie Lou Hamer was probably that first inspiration. And also, again, I'm going back to those days, Bob Moses, who was just an incredibly humble, effective, brilliant organizer. And I go back to them because, particularly in these days, they represent to me hope. And they didn't know, they didn't know whether they would succeed. They had no idea that they were really going to wipe out and end legal segregation. And I think about that a lot because, today I meet a lot of people who are despairing, and I talk to them about those heroes of mine and that inspiration. And I make the point that we don't know what the future holds because the future is not predetermined. And so hope is not a prediction. It's not based on certainty. Hope is a decision you make to fight for what is really right and good and decent. And it's based on that unassailable fact that the future is not predetermined. And therefore we all have agency. And what all of us do is what's going to shape the future.
Now, going along with that, what you just said, so we are right now in this country seeing a lot of protests pushing back against the current administration. And what would you say to people? So what I was seeing a lot amongst my own, people that I know, where a lot of people might have attended the protest this past weekend, right, and they were very energized by it. But then they're asking, what do I do next? How do I keep this feeling? How do I keep going? What would you recommend for people?
I talk about this a lot. The mobilization around No Kings was absolutely essential, but it's not enough. And so what we need, we're doing pretty well on the mobilizing front. We need more on the organizing front. And so that means that people who are participants in a protest have to become organizers for the future and have to say, okay, how can I get 4 or 5 people who I know who did come to a protest to come to the next one? And how can I form a little group? Maybe all we do is eat and read and discuss what's going on and then write some postcards for an election or make phone calls for an election or participate in a boycott. But then we're meeting and sustaining ourselves, and then we're willing to recruit the people on the sidelines. So we're in a race right now. So the authoritarian forces in the White House are racing to consolidate their power through the control of the federal government. The thing is, they're enormously unpopular. Unlike the civil rights movement and the anti-war Vietnam War movement, where the protests really started as a sort of prophetic minority, the majority of the country is opposed to what's happening today. The question is, can that majority get organized and build enough political power that it overcomes the law-breaking, unconstitutional power grab that's going on at the federal government level? And there'll be key tests of that: more protests, more boycotts. Think about what happened with Jimmy Kimmel. There's an example of power. He was not going back on the air until several million people canceled their subscriptions And Disney said, okay, we have to put him back. And then we've got the 26 elections. We've got elections right now, next 2 weeks. But we've got the 26 elections, which are going to be essential. Can we take back the House? Can we take back the Senate? And there are things that everybody can do, even remotely, to help make that come true. So my main message would be organize, organize, organize. I'm sort of a broken record over all these decades. It's like organize, build a little group, join Indivisible, join the Third Act, join the union, start your own group, make it a book club to start or a lunch club to start, but talk about what's going on, read about what's going on, and then work together to make the protests larger, to make the boycotts larger, to make the elections turn out the way we want them to.
And how would you say, I mean, I know a lot of us, or people who want to be activists, run up against, people who feel the opposite way, which you did quite a bit, especially in the beginning of the anti-war movement. And what's your advice for people trying to work with, quote unquote, the other side?
Yeah, no. So I think we have to be realistic. I think there's probably roughly right around a third of the country that is deeply attached to Trump and to authoritarianism, and unfortunately, most of that to white supremacy. And we're not going to convince them. It's just not going to happen. But they're only a third. Then, there's another 20%, 25% who voted for Trump, and they voted for Trump because they wanted change, and they saw the Democrats as elitist, and also, most importantly, as defending a failed status quo. And then there's another group. So in the 2024 election, there were 15 million people who had voted for Biden in the 2020 election who did not cast a ballot at all. And again, they tended to be younger. They tended to see Harris as defending a failed status quo, and they wanted change. And so they couldn't bring themselves to vote for Trump, so they didn't vote at all. If they had voted, by the way, they would have voted for Harris, and she would have won. But they didn't vote at all. We have to reach them. In every case, I think you have to approach people who disagree with you with respect and to believe in their decency, even if they disagree with you, and look for points that you have in common. And right now, there are a couple. One is the cost of living. Many, many people who voted for Trump voted for him because they thought he would lower the cost of living, and he's increasing it. So we can talk about that. There are many people who voted for Trump because they thought he was only going to be arresting and deporting, as he put it, the worst of the worst. And now they're seeing very law-abiding, hard-working folks who've been in this country for 10 and 20 years being kidnapped, car windows being smashed, being dragged out of their cars, and being put in camps. And they don't support that. But you can't have that conversation where you start by shaming them. How could you possibly have voted for Trump? What a terrible thing. It's all your fault. You have to open up a discussion, and to do that, you have to look for the places where there is some agreement, even where there'll be lots and lots of disagreement on other issues. And you have to do it with love and respect.
That's hard for a lot of people, but
I understand it's hard.
But I agree, and I think that's
I mean, if we want to reach people, if we don't want to reach people, fine. We can just wave our flag and tell them. And yeah, yes, there are mornings when I wake up where I look at what's about to happen and I realize how many people are going to have their health insurance doubled, and how probably a majority of them voted for Trump. And so, yeah, there are moments where I wake up and say, okay, you're getting what you, and then I go, no, that's wrong. One, they deserve really good health care at an affordable price. And two, they didn't ask for this, and they shouldn't be experiencing it. It's going to be the same. The Republicans were very smart about phasing in the cuts to Medicaid and all of that after the midterms, except they forgot about the subsidies, a really stupid mistake on their part. And so, a lot of the people who voted for Trump are going to see their disability insurance cut, they're going to see their food assistance cut, and they're going to suffer in ways that hopefully allow us to talk with them and say, let's look at what the future should bring. The strategic dilemma those of us who are just fighting to save democracy are in is that Trump is a destroyer, and he's destroying so much, and we want to defend it. But if we defend the status quo, we're ultimately going to lose, because the status quo hasn't worked. It's like with higher education. If we say higher education has to be defended, certainly its autonomy, academic freedom, and free speech have to be defended. But the reality is that higher education isn't working for enough people. You have, huge, crippling student debt. You have 60% of the population that can't even consider going to a community college or a four-year college. You don't have the apprentice programs and the training programs. So we have to both defend academic freedom, but we also have to say higher education should work for the vast majority, and Trump is making it less accessible, more expensive. Student debt is being piled on, and we need to reverse all of that, not just defend.
Yeah. It's got a lot of work.
It always is a lot of work. In fact, it's the hard work of hope.
It is the hard work of hope. What my last question is, do you have a library card?
I do, to the Gleason Public Library in Carlisle, Mass, where I live. And I love libraries. I think they are one of the institutions that our democracy thrives on and needs and should invest more heavily in.
Fantastic. Well, we could obviously talk for hours. However, the show is not that long. So I thank you so much for coming in and talking to me today. It's been a real pleasure. And do you have anything else in the pipeline that you're working on, book-wise?
I do have a second memoir.
Ooh, all right.
We'll see. This one's a much more personal and also delves into my very interesting family and their lives, as well as how that has cascaded down the generations to affect my choices and my mistakes. So I don't have a publisher, but I'm working on it.
That. All right, well, we'll look forward to that one.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, very much. All right. And thank you all for watching this episode of A Novel Idea. Tune in to our old episodes and look forward to the next one. We'll see you next time.